Quarry. The Convocation of 10 had judged 411 candidate species since its founding and rejected 389 of them before the proving ever began, a courtesy extended to species so obviously unsuited to galactic membership that dropping them onto the Crucible world would have been, in the Convocation's own cold phrasing, an unnecessary expenditure of a perfectly good trial. Earth was not one of those 389. Earth's petition had crossed the Convocation's desk accompanied by a border skirmish report that unsettled 4 of the 10 thrones, badly enough that the vote to proceed directly to trial passed without debate. They wish to know precisely what we are, Ava Reyes told the empty debarkation chamber 3 hours before the drop, checking the seals on a survival suit that had been built to Earth specifications rather than the Convocation's, and would therefore, according to the trial proctor's own dry assessment, offer approximately 40% less protection than any prior candidate has been permitted. I intend to make sure they never forget the answer. The proctor, a spindled, many-jointed Orin whose entire function within the Convocation existed to observe and never to intervene, studied her with the particular patience of a being that had watched 389 species fail to understand what they were walking into. "You have not asked me the survival statistics," it observed. "I don't need them," Ava said. "I already know what they're going to be used for. They're not for me. They're for whoever's supposed to be reassured, watching me lose." She had spent the 11 weeks of preparation the Convocation permitted her not on the physical conditioning every prior candidate species had reportedly obsessed over, but on something considerably harder to measure. Watching, in exhaustive detail, every recording the Convocation was willing to release of prior provings, cataloguing not how each candidate had died, but how each hunter had approached the killing, the specific complacent rhythms of 10 species who had never once needed to treat a hunt as anything but a formality. She had learned to move quietly through a room the way she imagined a champion might learn to move through a battlefield, unhurried, watchful, giving away nothing of what she actually intended, until the exact moment it no longer mattered whether anyone saw it coming. The proctor, escorting her the final distance to the drop shuttle, found himself, for reasons his species' emotional architecture did not entirely equip him to name, faintly unsettled by how calmly she carried herself toward a trial built, in 11,000 years of design, to be unsurvivable. "Most candidates weep in this corridor," he told her, an observation rather than a judgment, or rage, or beg, quietly, for a reprieve they know will not be granted. "You have done none of these things." "I've already made my peace with what I'm about to do," Ava said. "I'm not sure your Convocation's made its peace yet with what that's going to look like from the other side." The rules of the proving had not changed in 11,000 years, and the Convocation had made certain Ava understood every one of them before the drop shuttle's doors sealed behind her. A candidate species submitted one representative, unaugmented, minimally equipped, dropped alone onto the Crucible world's surface without support, extraction, or contact of any kind, to be hunted across the planet's single vast, deliberately hostile continent by 10 champions, one seat allotted to each of the Convocation's founding worlds, each of them among the deadliest combatants their species had ever produced. The Krivani alone filled their single seat with 2 bodies rather than one, a bonded pair sharing a single mind between them. A peculiarity of their species' hunting tradition the Convocation had long since stopped bothering to explain to candidates who would not live long enough to ask a second time. Survive 5 days without capture or death, and the candidate species received conditional membership, a probationary seat at the Convocation's outer table. Survive 10, and membership became full and permanent. Survive 30. The entire duration the champions were authorized to hunt before the trial's automatic conclusion, and the candidate species would be granted something no species in 11,000 years of Convocation history had ever earned: recognition as a core member, an equal seat among the 10 thrones themselves, with all the founding authority that implied. No candidate had ever reached day 10. 2 in 11,000 years had reached day 7. The champions, for their part, operated under a single asymmetry the Convocation had built into the trial from its founding and never once revised. They were permitted to kill. The candidate was not required to survive them gently, was owed no formal mercy in return, and the Convocation's official record keepers had long since stopped pretending the distinction mattered in practice. Of the 411 candidates who had faced the proving, 340 had died on the Crucible world's soil, most of them within the first 36 hours. "You should understand," the proctor told her in the drop shuttle's final moments, that the champions selected for your trial were not chosen gently either. The Convocation does not believe your species poses a genuine threat to 10 of its finest combatants. It does, however, wish to make an unambiguous point to any world watching about what happens to species who mistake admission for an invitation to weakness. Good, Ava said, watching the Crucible world's storm-racked continent resolve beneath the shuttle's descending hull. Then we understand each other completely. Day 1. She came down in a river gorge at the continent's northern edge, alone, armed with a single fixed-blade knife, a water purifier, and the clothes on her back, considerably less than any prior candidate had been permitted, though she had expected as much, and had spent the 11 weeks before the drop preparing for exactly that expectation rather than protesting it. The first champion found her within 6 hours. Threx Moore of the Kolvashi Ascendancy stood 2.5 meters of naturally armored muscle, a champion whose species had never lost a single proving engagement in the trial's entire recorded history, and he came through the gorge's northern tree line expecting, by his own later account to the Convocation, a soft, unarmed thing to be finished within the first day, as a courtesy to the schedule. Ava let him find her exactly where she wanted to be found, in the gorge's narrowest defile, where his considerable mass became, for the first time in his considerable career, a liability rather than an advantage. She had spent the 6 hours since her drop reading the terrain the way she had once read tactical archives on a much smaller battlefield, not for where she could hide, but for where an opponent's greatest strength could be turned, patiently and precisely, into his greatest weakness. Small thing? Threx Moore said, filling the defile's mouth entirely, his voice carrying the specific, bored contempt of a predator who had never once needed to take an opponent seriously. I will make this brief, out of respect for how far you have already come. You should, Ava said. Brief works considerably better for me than it does for you. She had rigged the defile's unstable upper wall in the hours before he arrived, a crude deadfall built from nothing but loose stone, and her own patient calculation of load-bearing weight. A trap that would have meant nothing against a smaller, more agile opponent, and meant everything against 2.5 meters of armored mass, moving at a full predatory charge. Threx Moore's own momentum brought half the defile wall down on top of him before he understood he had been herded rather than cornered, burying his lower body in rubble and shattering, in the collapse, the leg that had never once failed him in combat. He roared, a sound that shook loose dust from the defile's remaining walls, a sound built by 11,000 years of unbroken victory that had never once had to become a scream of pain instead, and clawed at the rubble, pinning him with enough raw force to tear his own claws bloody against the stone, and still could not free the leg the collapse had ruined. She was on him before the dust settled, not to finish him. She did not need to, and some colder, more deliberate part of her had already decided, in the 6 hours since her drop, exactly what she intended to do with each of the 10 instead, but to bind him methodically, with cord cut from his own harness webbing, while he raged and struggled, and finally, understanding what was actually happening to him, went very still. You are not killing me, he said, something in his voice shifting from contempt into a wariness he had clearly never expected to feel toward anything Earth had sent. No, Ava agreed. I'm keeping you. There's a difference, and by the time this is over, every one of you is going to understand exactly what it is. Day 3. Word of Threx Moore's capture reached the Convocation's observation relay within the hour and reached the remaining 9 champions considerably faster than the Convocation had ever intended. The trial's proctors maintained a shared tactical channel among the hunting party specifically to coordinate the kill, and what should have been a routine update instead threw the entire hunt into a confusion none of its architects had designed for. She has bound him, Vex Elan of the Sable Reach reported, examining the capture site's aftermath with the particular fastidious care of a species whose entire hunting tradition was built on invisibility rather than confrontation. Not killed, bound and marked, and left for us to find, as though she wished us to understand exactly what she intends for the rest of us. She did. Vex Elan found that out personally on the 3rd day, tracking Ava's trail through the Crucible world's ash forests with a stealth discipline that had never once failed him in 4 centuries of hunting, until he discovered, too late, that Ava had spent the 2 days since Threx Moore's capture doing something no prior candidate had ever bothered to attempt, learning the specific chemical signature of sable pheromone tracking, and salting her own trail with a false scent trail woven from Threx Moore's own captured harness fluids, leading Vex Elan in a slow, patient loop directly back toward the exact defile where she waited. He came at her from the shadows the way his species always did, confident in an invisibility that had never once been genuinely tested, and found, in the half-second before his blade would have opened her throat, that she was already moving, not away from the strike but into it, closing the distance a hunting predator always assumed its prey would try to create, until his own killing reach became too close to use at all. The knife she had carried since the drop found the gap in his environmental seal at his collar, precise and economical, and entirely without hesitation, and Vex Elan of the Sable Reach became the first champion to die in the Proving's current trial, choking on his own collapsing lung seal, while Ava knelt beside him, watching without satisfaction and without regret either, until it was over. "You didn't give me a choice," she told his body quietly in the ash forest's sudden silence. "I want that on the record, if anyone's still recording. He came to kill me. I offered him the same thing I offered Threx Moore. He decided invisibility meant he'd never have to actually answer for choosing to use it against someone who'd asked him not to." By the 5th day, the threshold no prior candidate had failed to reach only twice in 11,000 years, and had never once passed with 2 champions already removed from the board. The remaining 8 hunters abandoned the trial's traditional individual pursuit and began, for the first time in Proving history, coordinating openly, a violation of the hunt's founding solitary ethic that the Convocation's own proctors noted with visible alarm and did nothing to stop. "They are afraid," the proctor observing from orbit told the assembled Convocation. "I did not believe this trial's design permitted fear of the candidate to become the operative variable. I am no longer certain what I am observing." The twin Krivani champions, Ro and Vantik, bonded from birth through a neural link no prior candidate had ever faced simultaneously, found her on the 5th day at the edge of the continent's central salt flats, coordinating a pincer maneuver built on a psychic synchronization so complete that the two of them moved, fought, and reacted as a single mind split across 2 bodies. It should have been unbeatable. Ava had spent the previous night studying exactly how their coordination worked, watching from concealment as they hunted a smaller Crucible predator together, and had understood with the same cold clarity that had once dismantled Concord doctrine on a much larger battlefield, that a perfectly synchronized mind was only as strong as the assumption that both halves would always remain able to communicate. She separated them with nothing more sophisticated than a collapsed salt cavern and a well-placed charge built from Threx Moore's own confiscated demolition kit, burying Vantik under enough mineral density to sever the neural link entirely for the 11 minutes it took her to subdue Ro alone. 11 minutes in which Ro, suddenly and for the first time in his entire life genuinely isolated inside his own mind, fought with a desperation that came far closer to killing her than anything Threx Moore or Vex Elan had managed, opening a wound along her ribs that would ache for the remainder of the trial before she finally pinned him, bleeding and shaking, and bound him beside his brother once the collapsed cavern finally yielded him back. "You did not kill either of us," Ro said, when Vantik was finally freed and the twins sat bound together, their neural link restored and thrumming, Ava thought, with something considerably closer to shock than anger. "You could have. You had 11 minutes with me entirely alone. I do not understand why you chose otherwise." "Because you didn't come at me alone on purpose," Ava said, pressing a hand against her own bleeding ribs, exhausted in a way she had no intention of letting either of them see fully. "The Convocation split you two into this hunt without asking if you wanted a fair fight against one candidate. That's not on you. I'm not interested in punishing every choice that wasn't actually yours to make." Day 8. Grath the Undying of the Colossi Reach found her at the edge of the salt flats on the 8th day, and proved, within the first 90 seconds of engagement, precisely why his species had never once been included in a proving trial before the Convocation's most recent, most desperate revision of the hunting roster. A champion whose regenerative biology made conventional combat close to meaningless, capable of absorbing wounds that would have killed any of the other 9 hunters outright, and simply continuing forward, patient and unbothered, until sheer physical attrition finished what any single blow could not. Ava put her knife through his throat in the engagement's opening exchange, a strike that would have ended Threx Moore or Vex Elan instantly, and watched, with a cold, clinical fascination, she did not have time to fully indulge as the wound sealed itself shut within seconds, Grath advancing through his own spilling blood as though the injury belonged to someone else entirely. "You cannot kill what does not stay dead," he told her, almost gently, closing the distance her knife strike had bought her only a handful of extra seconds. "I would advise you save your strength for an opponent who can actually be ended by it." She did not try to kill him again. She had understood, in the half-second his throat closed over, that ending Grath the Undying was never going to be the correct problem to solve, and spent the following 6 hours instead doing something no prior candidate would ever have thought to attempt, exhausting him. She led him across the worst terrain the salt flats offered, forcing his regenerative biology to spend itself again and again on wounds she inflicted specifically because they would heal, not because they would matter, watching his monstrous stamina, vast, but not, she had gambled correctly, actually infinite, burn steadily down engagement after engagement until his 6th pursuit finally slowed enough for her to drive him, staggering and hollow-eyed with a fatigue his own species had never been designed to survive, into a mineral trench she had prepared the night before, and seal him inside it with a containment charge strong enough to hold even a body that could heal through almost anything else. "I could not kill you," he admitted, through the trench's sealed opening, something that might have been respect roughening his voice. "I did not expect that failure to come from patience rather than strength." "Patience is a kind of strength," Ava said. "Your convocation just never bothered to measure it." By the 10th day, full membership, unprecedented and unbroken in 11,000 years, achieved by a species the convocation had expected to fail within the first 36 hours, Ava Reyes had claimed 3 of the convocation's 10 champion seats and killed 1 hunter outright, the remaining 6 growing steadily more desperate as the hunt's carefully engineered confidence collapsed into something considerably closer to fear. Clestrix of the Scarin Nest died on the 12th day, not by Ava's blade, but by his own acid-blooded species' final, furious act of self-destruction, when he understood, mid-engagement, that the trap she had built into a dead Crucible predator's carcass had already compromised his exoskeleton beyond any hope of survival, a death Ava had not intended and grieved in her own quiet way more than either of the deaths she had chosen directly, understanding that his species' particular biology had made an even fight simply impossible from the first moment he'd committed to the ambush. Mother Issa of the Umbral Communion nearly succeeded where every other champion had failed, reaching Ava's mind on the 18th day through a psychic assault that came closer to unmaking her entirely than any physical wound the trial had yet produced. 3 full hours of Ava fighting not an opponent she could see, but the specific, patient dismantling of her own certainty, memories surfacing that Mother Issa twisted, gently and without visible cruelty, into doubt, into the suggestion that perhaps the entire trial was already lost, that surrender would cost her nothing but the acknowledgement of a truth she was fighting too hard to admit. It was, in the end, the same discipline that had carried her through every physical engagement that saved her from the psychic one, the patient, unglamorous habit of examining a threat clearly, rather than reacting to the fear it was designed to produce. She found the seam in Mother Issa's assault the same way she had found the seam in every champion's confidence before her. Not a weakness in the attack's strength, but in its assumption that she would fight it the way it expected to be fought, and turned Mother Issa's own psychic reach back against her with a single, devastatingly simple realization offered not as a weapon, but as a plain fact, that the Communion's entire hunting doctrine depended on prey believing itself alone, and Ava, for the whole of the 18 days behind her, had never once actually been alone in the way that mattered, because 5 bound champions now sat in her camp bearing quiet, grudging witness to exactly how far she had already come. Mother Issa's assault broke against that fact, the way every other champion's confidence had broken before it, and Ava bound her, shaking and hollowed before the day was through, the first time in the Umbral Communion's long, unbroken history of psychic dominance that one of its own had been made rather than the hunted, to feel the specific terror of a mind it could not fully unmake. Day 19. Doroth of the Sorin Mirakin, the last of the concealment specialists, still hunting free, made his attempt on the 19th day, and came closer than any prior champion to succeeding through cunning rather than force alone, a species whose entire biology was built around flawless mimicry, capable of reshaping voice, gait, and surface features into a perfect copy of anything it had studied closely enough. He had spent 9 days shadowing Ava's camp from careful concealment, close enough to study Mother Issa's captured bearing and the twins' bound, murmuring cadence in exhaustive, patient detail, before finally walking into her camp wearing Threxmore's own broad-shouldered shape and voice, claiming to have slipped his bonds and come to warn her of an ambush waiting at the ridge. It was, Ava admitted to herself afterward, a genuinely excellent copy, flawless in every physical detail she could have named. What Dorothy had not studied closely enough, in 9 days of careful observation from a distance, was the specific, quiet rhythm of an actual conversation between captor and captive, the particular guarded respect that had grown, slowly and without either of them fully choosing it, between herself and Threx Moore across 3 weeks of shared captivity. The false Threx Moore addressed her with a deference the real one had stopped offering a week earlier, and Ava, recognizing the mistake within the first 4 sentences, let him finish the entire performance anyway, patient and unhurried, before driving her knife beneath the mimicked ribs, at the exact moment his concentration broke to check her reaction. "You copied everything except what actually happened between us," she told him, as the Sorin's borrowed shape dissolved back into his own beneath her blade, wounded but alive, disarmed before he could shift again. "That's the part you can't steal second-hand, Dorothy. I'd have thought a species built entirely around mimicry might have understood that going in." He yielded rather than force her to finish it, shaking and disoriented in his own true shape for the first time in 9 days, and she bound him beside the others with the same careful, unhurried patience she had extended to every champion who had ultimately chosen surrender over a death neither of them actually wanted. The Convocation, watching from orbit, made its first genuine attempt at interference on the 20th day, a quiet, unauthorized adjustment to the Crucible world's environmental controls that stripped Ava's camp of its water source overnight, a violation of the trial's own founding charter that only Iron Duke Rannoch of the Keshaval, last of the honor-bound champions still hunting free, was willing to openly condemn. "This is not the trial I agreed to fight," he told the proctor's relay, refusing his own hunting orders, for the first time in a 4-century career built entirely around, never once refusing one. "I did not travel here to win by starvation. I came to test myself against whatever this candidate actually is. I will not have that answer stolen from me by a convocation too frightened of what it might learn to let the trial finish honestly." He found her 3 days later at the continent's southern ridge, not to ambush her but to stand before her openly, energy blade drawn and offered in the Keshaval's oldest formal challenge, a duel neither concealment nor coordination, decided entirely on skill against skill, the single fair fight the entire proving had never once actually offered her. Ava accepted it, and it was, by her own private accounting afterward, the closest any engagement had come to costing her everything. Rannoch's 4 centuries of honed, honest skill, meeting her own hard-won adaptability in a duel that lasted the better part of an hour, blade against blade, each of them reading the other's next 3 moves, and adjusting faster than either had ever had to adjust against a genuinely equal opponent. She won it in the end, not through superior skill, but through the same quality that had carried her through every engagement before it, the specific human refusal to accept that an hour of exhaustion meant the fight was over, holding on 4 minutes past the point Rannoch's own considerable endurance finally began to fail, until his blade arm dropped a fraction of a second too slow, and her own found the opening. She did not kill him. She knelt beside him instead, in the ridge's cold wind, and offered him her hand exactly as he had once offered his blade, an equal's gesture freely given. "You fought me honestly," she said. "I'm not interested in ending that the same way the Convocation's been trying to end this whole trial. Yield and walk out of this with me. I think you've earned considerably better than what they had planned for either of us." Rannoch studied her for a long moment. 4 centuries of unbroken tradition warring visibly with something he had never once expected the proving to actually produce, and, for the first time in his entire life, yielded. Only 2 champions remained by the 25th day. Instrument Zeth of the Auric Choir, whose drone-augmented senses had spent 3 weeks tracking Ava from a careful technological distance rather than risking direct confrontation, and the Convergence, the Meridian Swarm's chosen avatar, a distributed hive intelligence wearing a single humanoid vessel that could, if the vessel itself were destroyed, simply reconstitute itself from spores already seeded across the entire continent. Zeth broke first, on the 27th day, ambushing Ava's camp with a full drone swarm rather than risking his own body in the confrontation his hunting doctrine had spent 3 weeks avoiding, a decision that cost him everything the moment Ava, who had spent those same 3 weeks reverse-engineering his drone's own targeting signatures from a damaged unit she'd recovered after Threx Moore's capture, turned his entire swarm back against his own position with a jammed relay signal built from nothing but salvaged Keshaval energy cell components, and the same patient, improvisational cunning that had carried her through every engagement before it. He surrendered before the swarm finished closing on his position, understanding with the particular clarity of a species built around remote calculation rather than personal risk exactly how thoroughly he had just been outcalculated. The convergence alone remained by the 30th and final day, and it was, of every champion the Crucible world had thrown against her, the only one Ava could not simply bind and set aside. A distributed intelligence with no single body worth capturing, no single mind she could reach through combat or persuasion, spread now across a full third of the continent's spore fields in a final, patient effort to simply outlast the trial's clock without ever risking direct confrontation at all. She found its central node in the last hours of the 30th day, not through combat, but through the same tactical patience that had defined every day before it, tracing the swarm's nutrient distribution patterns back to a single ancient cave system where the convergence's original consciousness had first taken root centuries earlier, the one location in its entire distributed network that could not be abandoned without the whole intelligence eventually, slowly, unraveling. She did not destroy it. She sealed it instead, methodically, with charges built from every scrap of confiscated champion equipment she had gathered across 30 brutal days. Szeth's drone relays, Rannoch's spent energy cells, the last of Grath's own containment charge components, salvaged and repurposed, trapping the Convergence's founding node in a containment field that left the wider swarm alive, intact, and entirely unable to reach her before the trial's clock ran out beneath her feet, the whole of it built from nothing but the patient accumulation of every mistake 9 prior champions had already made against her. The extraction shuttle found her at dawn, on the 31st day, standing at the center of the Crucible world's central salt flats with 8 champion seats bound, broken, sealed, or willingly surrendered around her. Threx Mor, Ro and Vantik, Grath the Undying, Mother Issa, Dorith, Rannoch, Szeth, and the sealed, contained remnant of the Convergence, and 2 graves, dug by her own hands in the ash forest and the acid-scarred nest ground where Vex Ilan and Clestrix had fallen, marked with nothing more than the truth of exactly how each of them had died. The Convocation's presiding elders received her not in the trial's original debarkation chamber, but in the 10 Thrones' own inner hall, a privilege no candidate species had ever been granted before the vote on their membership had even formally begun, and the silence that met her arrival carried none of the cold, procedural contempt that had greeted Earth's original petition 31 days earlier. No candidate has ever survived 30 days, the presiding elder told her, a being whose species had helped found the Convocation 9,000 years before Earth's first written language existed. No candidate has ever removed more than a single champion from the field. You have removed all 10. You have killed only the 2 who forced you to it, and returned the rest of this Convocation's finest combatants alive, bound, and by their own testimony, treated with more genuine honor than the trial itself extended to any of you. He was quiet a long moment, the assembled thrones behind him utterly still in a silence that carried, Ava thought, considerably more weight than any of their 11,000 years of careful ceremony had ever taught them to formally acknowledge. I confess this body does not entirely know what to do with what you have shown us. We built this trial to measure how a species dies. You have spent 30 days teaching us we asked the wrong question from the very first candidate onward. Then ask a better one, Ava said. I'd start with why it took you 11,000 years and 340 dead candidates to consider that mercy might have been on the table the entire time. I didn't win this trial by being crueler than the 10 you sent after me. I won it by being the first candidate who understood that surviving and destroying were never actually the same task, and that your Convocation had simply never bothered to build a trial capable of telling the 2 apart. I didn't come here to prove humanity could match your idea of strength, Ava said, standing before the 10 thrones, in a survival suit that had been built 40% weaker than any prior candidates and had, despite that, carried her through everything the Crucible world had thrown against it. I came to prove you'd been measuring the wrong thing the entire time. You built a trial to find out how hard we could be broken. I'd ask you to consider, now that it's over, what it means that not one of your champions actually managed it. The vote that followed was neither close nor comfortable. 4 of the 10 thrones abstained outright, unwilling to formally endorse a precedent their own species' champions had personally suffered under, and 1, the seat once held by the Colossi Reach until Grath's own testimony persuaded his elders otherwise, cast the session's single dissenting vote on the narrow grounds that 30 days was too brief a window to fully trust a species this dangerous with a permanent seat among them. But the Convocation of 10, forced for the first time in 11,000 years to consider a species that had not merely survived its founding trial, but fundamentally rewritten what surviving it meant, granted Earth Core membership before the session's end regardless, an outcome no founding charter had ever anticipated needing language for, and that the assembled elders spent the following decade quietly amending their oldest documents to accommodate. Ava Reyes returned to Earth 3 months later, carried home aboard a convocation vessel considerably more deferential than the one that had dropped her, alone and under-equipped, onto a planet built to break her. She did not speak publicly in the years that followed about the 2 graves she had dug on the Crucible world, or the particular weight of the choice she had made 8 separate times to offer mercy to beings sent specifically to deny her any. She simply carried it quietly, the way she had learned to carry everything that mattered, and let the galaxy draw its own conclusions from the fact that 10 champions who had never once lost a proving trial in 11,000 years of trying had each, in their own way, walked away from her still breathing, and had each, without exception, chosen never to speak of her afterward except with something that sounded, to every species listening, considerably closer to reverence than to the contempt they had all once carried into that first debarkation chamber. She kept in careful, occasional contact with several of them regardless. Threx Moore sent word on the anniversary of his capture each year of some new small proof that his people had begun, slowly and with visible reluctance, to reconsider what strength was actually built from. Rannoch wrote longer letters, formal in the old Keshaval style, always closing with the same line, that he remained, by his own honest accounting, the only champion in 11,000 years to have lost a duel and call it the finest hour of his life. She answered every one of them personally, in her own hand, never through an aide, because she understood, better than the Convocation's careful protocols ever managed to, that the particular currency she had won on the Crucible world was not fear at all, however thoroughly the galaxy had first mistaken it for exactly that. It was trust, earned the hardest possible way, from beings who had come to end her and found, instead, someone who had refused every opportunity the trial offered her to become as merciless as the rules technically allowed. Other species, watching from a more cautious distance, drew a considerably colder lesson from the same 30 days, that humanity, when finally measured honestly, was not the soft, dependent thing its lack of natural armor and unremarkable strength had always suggested to a galaxy built around exactly those metrics, but something considerably harder to categorize. Patient where patience served, ruthless where ruthlessness became the only honest option left, and always, unnervingly, several moves ahead of whatever assumption an opponent had walked in holding. The Convocation's outer worlds began within the decade, referring to her by a name none of the 10 thrones had ever officially sanctioned, and none of them ever quite managed to stop using either. The Widow of the Crucible, half warning and half something closer to awe, spoken in every language the Convocation governed with the same careful, respectful hush reserved for the handful of names history simply refused to let go of. The Convocation rewrote the proving's rules within the year, formally, permanently, forbidding any future trial from measuring a candidate species solely by how thoroughly it could be destroyed. 340 names were entered that same year into a new memorial register the Convocation had never before bothered to keep. Every candidate who had died in the trial's 11,000-year history, recorded at last, not as a footnote to some champion's unbroken record, but as a species that had simply never been given the chance Ava Reyes had been forced to carve out for herself, alone, on a planet built specifically to ensure she never would. It was, in the quiet, unglamorous way most lasting change actually happens, the truest victory of the entire 30-day trial. Not the 10 champions bound and broken on the Crucible world's salt flats, and not the seat Earth had won among the 10 thrones, but the simple, permanent fact that no species after her would ever again have to prove, the way she had, that strength and mercy had never actually been opposites at all. The end. If you enjoyed this video, press the like button, subscribe to the channel to help it grow, and leave a comment.